Hey guys, so a couple of things before we get started. Obviously this is first episode of Real vs. Real in a while. I plan on tweaking the show a little bit as we go on, and changing a couple of things and getting things a little bit more uniform and stuff like that. And my cat is scratching at a scratching post again. But for now, this setup is just gonna have to work. That's the first thing. The second thing is it's super hot today, so if you hear a clicking noise, I have my ceiling fan running. I had to turn off my air conditioning because I think that would be too loud, but I can't turn off both because it's really super hot. The third thing is this was one of the reviews that I actually didn't have done at the start of this week. It was a review that I had. I watched the movies and I had the script written, but I hadn't yet filmed everything, like, myself, actually reading out the script, or in the case of these videos, I guess sort of partial memorizing the script. So because of that, I couldn't get to it at the beginning of the week, and about halfway through the week I got sick. And I'm still sick. It's probably fairly noticeable. So if my voice cracks or sounds strange at points during the review, that's why. I still am in the middle of a cold. And if I look tired, that's why. So I just wanted to get that out of the way. That's why maybe some of the things in this review is gonna come off as maybe a little bit strange sounding. So yeah, that's it. Let's start the Real vs. Real.
Lately, when I'm staring out of my window, when I rest my head on my pillow, I just think of all the things that I need to be. You say that I gotta live up to your reasons. You're always coming up with new ones, and all these expectations are crashing down on me. But darling, can't you see? I may talk a little too much, I may get a little out of touch. I'm a little crazy and I'm not around enough. I may play a little too rough, I may get a little bit wound up. I'm a little lazy and I tend to interrupt. But lately I've been thinking that it's you that doesn't measure up.
Hey there, I'm the Animated Heroine. Let's talk about the environment. You leave when I say you do. Okay, so in the interest of keeping this channel light and fun and about animation and video games, and also in the interest of keeping insults on YouTube to just not liking a movie as much as you do, I'm not going to go into environmentalist issues or anything like that, as that's one of many topics these days that seem to be a little bit taboo.
Namely, let's talk about the environment as it relates to children's media. Back in the 90s, there was a huge emphasis on saving the environment in children's shows and movies. Not to mention the fact that most children's cartoons without an underlying environmental message had at least one or two specials related to the environment. Ferngully is a movie with a heavy environmental message, and as a 90s kid, I grew up with this movie. At the time it was released, it was pretty well received, got decent reviews. Jeffrey Katzenberg, who at the time was still the chairman of Disney, called up the producers to tell them that he loved the film. Roger Ebert gave it a decent review, and a lot of people my age have fond memories of it. Enter Epic, released in 2013. I reviewed this movie when I was still sort of starting out. Now, Epic does not have a blatant environmental message, or rather, it kind of does, but focuses more on the natural balance in nature rather than human interference. And after watching it, I did feel it shared some strong similarities with Ferngully. Both movies have an outsider brought into a hidden world inhabited by tiny people. In Ferngully, they're straight up called fairies. The only name we're really given in Epic is Leafman, but that doesn't cover the extensive amount of tiny people there actually are. Although we do get a name for the villains, Boggans. The outsider in Ferngully is Zack, accidentally shrunk because of the main character Krista. In Epic, it's MK, who is at the wrong place at the wrong time, or right place at the right time, I guess, and is shrunk by the Queen. In both movies, those tiny people take care of the forest, and in both movies there is a particular individual with special abilities. In Ferngully, it's Magi, who's sort of like a wise elder. In Epic, it's Queen Tara, who can grow the forest around her. And spoilers, both of these characters die, although it only makes sense in one movie, but we'll get to that later. Both movies ultimately are resolved because of a seed or bud, and in both films there is a romance between the human character and one of the fairies/tiny people.
So, since it's been a while, let's get started. Will it be the nostalgic, traditionally animated environmentalist film, or the CG animated fantasy epic? And speaking of animation, there's your first category.
As many of you know, I am a fan of traditional animation, and Ferngully looks pretty good. There's some nice environments, not that particularly accurate to rainforests in a lot of ways, but pretty nonetheless. The animation looks like it can almost go toe-to-toe with Disney. Almost. It's pretty, but the fluidity of movement is where it occasionally falls a teensy bit short. Sometimes it's really good, and sometimes it's a little awkward. Still, overall, it's a nice looking film. There was never really a question about Epic's animation. It was pretty clear this movie was going to be gorgeous after seeing the trailers. Now, I know some people who won't even watch CG, but I have nothing against the animation style. I just wish it hadn't completely taken over traditional animation in America. Epic's animation toes that line of hyper-realism, especially with the backgrounds, while still maintaining stylized character designs, which is great because it means that it gets the most out of its environments while avoiding the uncanny valley. 4 years later, it's still pretty as hell. So while I'm a fangirl for traditional animation, I'm going to give Epic this one. There's no denying that it's just better looking.
Okay, I'm gonna go over this next category as quickly as possible, because in my opinion, it is a no-brainer. One of these movies is a musical. The other is not. The point goes to the film that is not a musical. Alright, I'll go into a little more detail than that.
First of all, fans of Toxic Love can just shut up right now. This movie has like 3 proper musical songs and a handful of extremely dated background songs that seem to be trying to imitate Disney without that special quality of Disney musicals in the 90s. You know, like being good and stuff. 2 of the 3 songs sung by characters in the actual movie are sung by a character we never see again for no apparent reason, and the painfully forced rap song by Robin Williams, which should honestly be the beginning and end of my argument.
Epic doesn't have Robin Williams rapping. Done.
The other song is Toxic Love, which is fun in its own way but doesn't really justify the rest of the terrible music, which also includes Discount Circle of Life. Generic mood music.
Raining like magic. It's raining life.
And royalty-free 80s music sound-alike track. Epic has 1 song in the beginning, which is fine, 1 song sung by a character, which is both brief and not horrible, and the score, which while not quite to liken Focus's level of instantly making me notice it, does sound nice and carries the film well enough. Ferngully's score can be nice at times, but the terrible musical numbers and bad background music kinda drowns that out. Epic wins.
Okay, so aesthetically, Epic is ahead. It looks and sounds better. Now it's time to get into the real meat of the films, characters and story. And since it has been a while since we've done this, I'm going to go over a few new rules. As you've probably noticed, I've actually been keeping points. And that's how it's going to go from now on. 1 point for animation, 1 point for music, 3 points for characters for hero, villain, and support, and 1 big fat point for story that we'll say is also worth 3, at least for the time being. Let's go to characters.
Let's let's start with the main character. Now, there's a bit of a role reversal in these two films. The human, or outsider, in Ferngully is Zack, who is not the main character. Krista is the supernatural character that links us to the magical part of this world. In Epic, the main character is MK. She's the outsider in that movie. So in Ferngully, we're more following the perspective of a character who's familiar with the fantasy elements in the film and is learning about the human side, while in Epic, we're following the perspective of a character who is familiar with the human world and is learning about the supernatural side of things. Now, it's been a while since I've watched this film, or rather, it's been a while since I first watched this film. Obviously, I watched it again for this review and took notes. But I think in my initial review, I said I liked the main character. I still do. MK is pretty cool. I remember being worried that they'd pull that relatable teen thing, but she has an interesting arc with her father where you can 100% see her perspective. In fact, I think I was actually a little critical of the father's side of things in my original review. She exhibits an admirable amount of empathy while still reacting to her situation in a believable way and still desperate to get home, and she's a strong character, but she shows that strength in believable ways. She also messes up enough times to show she's not perfect and still trying to integrate into this world. Krista is basically an Ariel clone. I mean, straight up, Ariel clone. Distracted from her own routine, curious about humanity in ways that frequently put her in harm's way, naive about human customs, blah blah blah. She does get to save the day and rescue the dude a couple times, but she's a pretty typical 90s heroine otherwise, i.e., she's kinda boring. First point goes to Epic for having the better strong female lead. Next, we go to the villain. The villain in Epic is Mandrake, who is in charge of the Boggans. He represents natural decay. They don't go into too much detail over it, but it's stated that there's a natural balance between growth and decay, and Mandrake wants to throw this balance off by killing the queen and spreading his decay to everything. Honestly, he's not a spectacular villain, just because he comes off as a wee bit typical. He gets some points for actually caring about his son, but this would have been more interesting if they hadn't killed his son off so soon, and had taken just a smidgen more time to flesh this out. Just take some of the airtime off of the comic relief. Apart from this, he's evil and wants to destroy the world. Hexus's motivations really aren't all that much more complex. He's basically a physical embodiment of pollution, except he existed before there really was much pollution, so We'll get into the way the story handles these characters when we get to that category. For now, let's just go strictly off how enjoyable the characters themselves are, and honestly, Hexus is more memorable than Mandrake. He just is. He's weird, he's kind of funny, he's creepy as hell at some points. He just leaves a stronger impression. I mean, I actually like the Boggan's design, but the villain is sadly pretty typical. Second point goes to Ferngully.
So now let's get into side characters, and at least to start off with, I'll try to keep some of the similar characters lumped together.
Love interest or supporting hero. In Ferngully, it's Zack, who's working with, I assume, the logging company, marking trees to be cut down by a machine called the Leveler. And like Krista, he's a big ol' stereotype. John Smith clone. I mean, I'm pretty sure this movie came out before that movie, but I stand by my statement. Also, his hip lingo is painful, and I hesitate to believe it was even relevant at the time. Nod is also kind of a stereotype, though. In this case, he's the wild, reckless teen who doesn't need anyone and disobeys authority. Think Jim from Treasure Planet. I find him less painful to watch than Zack, but I'm not really giving either of them credit towards a point. As I said, both movies have a singular person with more important magical abilities. We spend very little time with either character, as Magi is not in most of the movie and Tara dies fairly early. But I'm going to give credit to Tara because her personality comes out a lot more than Magi,
who is just the wise elder and nothing else.
Whereas Tara is established as wise, powerful, and likable pretty quickly. Next is the comic relief, which I still think is the biggest weakness for Epic in my personal opinion. Now, I'm not saying Batty is necessarily a great character, but Robin Williams' delivery helps a bit, whereas the slugs do what comic relief always tend to do when something serious and interesting is happening. They derail it for unfunny and groan-worthy scenes like this.
Credit goes to Batty. It's probably the only time you'll ever hear me say that.
That leaves the rest of the characters, and in this case, one movie definitely outshines the other, because the other side characters in Ferngully are pretty forgettable. In Epic, we have Nimgaloo and Bomba and Ozzy, all who provide decent comic relief, making these characters all the more pointless, and there's Ronan, who is a total badass.
In fact, Ronan single-handedly wins the point for side characters for Epic. And I've got to admit, it's looking a little bit one-sided, but we still have story, and that is worth 3. And technically, if Ferngully gets it, these two movies will be tied. Let's take a look, shall we?
Epic follows MK, who's traveling to her father's house shortly after her mother's death. Her father and her mother were separated because her father became obsessed with tiny men in the forest. This also ruined his career because, well, yeah, it would. After MK fails to have a normal conversation with her father without him getting distracted by his obsession, she decides to leave, but is unable to because she has to chase after Ozzy, their aged, 3-legged pug who gets out of the house. She winds up running into Queen Terra as she's dying after being shot by Mandrake and gets pulled into an adventure to deliver the Queen's heir, a seed pod that must bloom when the moon is at its highest so that it might become the next queen and the forest can survive. This is clearly meant to be a fantasy epic, hence the name. It's kind of like a kid version of something like Lord of the Rings and is written to be as such.
For the time being, let's leave it at that and go to Ferngully. I have my reasons.
Ferngully follows a society of fairies that have helped the forest grow for eons. In the beginning, it talks about an evil spirit called Hexus who tried to destroy the forest but was trapped in a tree by Magi. Humans are said to be extinct, but Krista runs into one in the forest and accidentally shrinks him to save him from getting brained by a tree. The humans are cutting down the trees in the forest, and this eventually leads them to Hexus's tree, which they cut down despite the fact that it clearly has a demon in it. I mean, look at that thing, come on. Never free tree demons, it doesn't end well. Hexus then draws power from the machine and its pollution and uses it to attempt to once again destroy Ferngully.
It's clear that Ferngully is meant to be an environmentalist film first and a fantasy film second. But is it a good environmentalist film, and does it hold up outside of that?
Well, if this were an On the Rack review, I would start off by pointing out the lack of logic. There are multiple scenarios where this movie's plot is moved forward by events that do not make sense. For instance, Zack is shrunk because he decides it's a good idea to try to catch what I can only assume he thinks is a bug. Dude, you are in the forest. Bugs are everywhere. When's the last time any of you dropped what you were doing to catch a bug outside to the extent of not noticing that you're about to die? Okay, so Zack is an idiot. That's feasible. How about Magi's death? Magi dies towards the end of the film, and I'm not clear as to why. Okay, I do know why. It's so Krista can be the hero and save the day, but in the context of the plot, I don't know why. She turns herself into sparkles to change the colors of the fairies' lights so they can close this tree, which doesn't really help anyone anyways, and that's it. Why does she have to sacrifice herself again? Compare these two moments to what could loosely be called their counterparts in Epic. MK is leaving her father's house, only for Ozzy to get free, so she chases after him, as you would, into the forest and happens to come across the Queen as she's dying. The Queen is dying because of basically a political assassination carried out by her enemies. MK gets pulled into the action because she was the only one there at the time, and the Queen dies because she was shot with an arrow from the enemy. Zack gets pulled into the action because he was chasing after a light and apparently has the attention span of a cat, and Magi died because... magic? I may not be fond of the comic relief in Epic, and honestly I feel like the romance between MK and Nod is missing a scene between the bird flying moment and the deer riding moment, but Epic is also over an hour and a half and for the most part focuses on the important elements of the story, taking breaks to show some actually pretty decent action and occasionally something that could admittedly be cut a bit shorter. Ferngully has full songs dedicated to stretching out the already short 80-minute runtime that have nothing to do with anything.
But it's got a good message, right? Well, does it?
So here's the problem with Ferngully's villain from a plot standpoint. he actually has nothing to do with pollution. I mean, Pollution Monster would be kind of lame, but Hexus is basically just some supernatural thing that feeds off of pollution. He doesn't exist because people are cutting down all of the trees or abusing the environment. He's a threat because they happened to cut down the one tree he was trapped in. In the book Disney, Pixar, and the Hidden Messages of Children's Films, the author states that Ferngully is somewhat vague in its explanation of the dire consequences of the rainforest destruction, and it addresses the economic impetus behind this destruction hardly at all. The fact that the rainforest was saved at the end of the film diminishes the urgency of its environmentalist message, and that the villain displaces the real blame for environmental destruction from its real perpetrators onto non-existent supernatural perpetrators, further diluting the political message. Now, maybe some of that is overthinking it a little bit, but at least to some extent, I'm inclined to agree.
I'll tell you exactly how big of an impression this movie left on me as a kid. I thought this scene was pretty, I liked the glowing water, and I remember pretending the tree in my front yard was evil. And that's about it. Honestly, remember the movies that I mentioned at the beginning of this review? I think Rocko's Modern Life did a much better job of explaining the importance of recycling to kids than movies like Ferngully. In fact, let me see if I can remember that song. And this is not in my script. This is off the top of my head. And you can hear me singing it while my voice is clearly cracking from this terrible cold. R-A-C-Y-C-L-E, recycle, C-O-N-C-E-R-V, conserve, don't you P-O-L-L-U-T, pollute the river, sky, or sea, or else you're gonna get what you deserve. I haven't seen that episode in years.
Epic has its flaws, but it does take its story relatively seriously. Pretty much everything that's introduced is utilized later in the movie, most of the characters are likable, the movie is resolved in a satisfying way, and the pacing is mostly on point. To be honest, the movie was better than I remembered.
At the very least, I feel like the Rotten Tomatoes scores on these two movies should be reversed. Regardless, after watching them back to back, it was pretty obvious that Epic was the better movie. At 80 minutes, Ferngully was a bit of a slog, and I actually enjoyed watching Epic again. I don't know if it just didn't age well, or if the cracks just show more the older you get, but Ferngully isn't that great of a film, to be honest. So, if you want to show your kids something about the environment, show them WALL-E, or hell, if you want to show your kids something about the environment that was made in the 90s and has aged well, show them Avatar: The Last Airbender. I'm the Animated Heroine. I'm going to down a whole bunch of cold medicine.
Lately, when I'm staring out of my window, when I rest my head on my pillow, I just think of all the things that I need to be. You say that I gotta live up to your